Good evening, everyone. Good to see you all. I would like to invite you to stand and join me in singing "O Worship the King." Oh, worship the King, all glorious above, and gratefully sing His wonderful love, our shield and defender. is Lord.
It is good to see everybody here tonight. If you want to open your Bibles, we will be in Acts chapter 18. Acts chapter 18, we have been making our way through Paul's missionary journeys, going through the book of Acts, Paul's missionary journeys. We've taken a few weeks off. Of course, last week was Easter. The week before, we had family fellowship. So it's been a while, and I kind of left us hanging in the middle of Corinth. That's where Paul was at. We were halfway through Paul's time in the book of Corinth. So tonight, we're going to very descriptive title, Corinth and Beyond. I couldn't come up with much else than that. But tonight we're going to finish up Paul's time in the town of Corinth and where he goes following that. But since it's been a few weeks, I always think it's helpful to kind of take some time to kind of go back. And I've actually added something we haven't looked at before. I think it's helpful to kind of have a little bit of a timeline of the Apostle Paul's life. Now, obviously, with this being almost 2,000 years ago that this happened, and we try to date together. We're not going to have exact dates, and you can look at different people, and everybody has their own opinion. But most of these dates are within a couple years of probably what it actually was. We don't know the exact. We can there's certain things that can kind of help us. So I have a little thing here. I don't know if that's big enough, but hopefully I try to put it all in one. And we're not necessarily going to go through all of this, but if you look at the Apostle Paul, where we are at right now, okay, is Paul's second missionary journey, okay, during his second missionary journey. And his second missionary journey was probably about 3 years or so, from about 50 AD or AD 50 to about AD 53. If we go back, we don't know when Paul was born, sometime around, best guess is probably, 5 AD or something like that. He was born in Tarsus. He grew up. We have some of these early things. The Jerusalem Council, his first missionary journey probably took place around 47, 48 AD. That was probably a couple years. He had the Jerusalem Council. But what we're here, and what's important for us to understand, what was important for me to try to put these things together is what was going on in Paul's life. The dates necessarily aren't that important, the exact dates, but what was going on. One of the important things for us to note here is that during Paul's second missionary journey, now Galatians is something we don't know about, so I'm not going to mention that, but he wrote First Thessalonians and Second Thessalonians from Corinth right during this time, okay? So we've been following Paul's second missionary journey. Of course, he left Antioch, and he traveled through the area of about Galatia, where he went to churches like Lystra, Derbe. He picked up Timothy. Then he went over into northern Greece, Philippi, Thessalonica, Berea. He came to Athens. Then he gets to Corinth, and this is where we're at in our travels through the second missionary journey. And that during that year and a half in Corinth, he wrote the books of 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. Okay, so that's helpful for us to kind of remember what's going on as far as the timeline there. But we bring us here to Acts chapter 18. Last time, we went through verses 1 through 11. I just want to kind of skim over a couple things there that's important. All right, so just kind of there in Acts chapter 18, verses 1 through 11. Verse 1 says this: After this, Paul left Athens and came to Corinth. Okay, verse 2, he found Aquila and Priscilla. Okay, so he meets Aquila and Priscilla. All right, skip down to verse 5. Verse 5 says this: when Silas and Timothy arrived from Macedonia. If you remember, Macedonia is up north. That's where Thessalonica, Philippi were. All right, and that is when, okay, back to this timeline here. That's when Paul wrote 1 Thessalonians. Okay, because Timothy had come from Thessalonica. He came to Corinth with good news about how the Thessalonians were doing, and that prompted Paul to write 1 Thessalonians. Okay? So basically, poor Timothy, all right? Timothy had traveled to Thessalonica to check on them. They were doing great, so he comes and he tells Paul, and Paul says, oh, that's great. Here. So Paul quickly writes a letter and says, now go back to Thessalonica. So Timothy's just going back and forth, all right? So that's when Paul writes. So really right around, verse 5, when it says when Paul and Silas and Timothy arrived, that's around when Paul wrote 1 Thessalonians, okay? And then, of course, he keeps preaching. Verse 6, when the Jews opposed Paul's preaching there in the synagogue, Paul said, your blood be on your heads. I am innocent. From now I will go to the Gentiles. All right, so Paul began preaching in Corinth at the synagogues, but because of their opposition, he says, I'm done with you. I'm going to go preach to the Gentiles. For the rest of his time, it says that he preached in this man, Titius Justus. Okay? And then we get down to verse 9. We ended this last time in verse 9. And the Lord said to Paul one night in a vision, do not be afraid, but go on speaking and do not be silent, for I am with you, and no one will attack you to harm you, for I have many in this city who are my people. And he stayed 1 year and 6 months. So Paul stayed in Corinth for 18 months because God gave him this promise that during your time here in Corinth, no one's going to harm you. I'm going to protect you. You're going to be fine. Stay here. Do the work of the ministry here. And Paul's going to stay there for 18 months. All right? So for 18 months, Paul is going to stay there. Now, that brings us to today's message and what we're going to be talking about tonight. Tonight, we're going to cover verses 12 through 23, the end of Paul. So this is the very end of Paul's second missionary journey. Okay, remember, he's already been to these other places, Thessalonica, Philippi, Berea, Athens, all these other places he's been to. Corinth is his last place he's going to be for an extended period of time. He's going to leave Corinth. He's going to quickly stop in Ephesus. He's going to make his way back to eventually Antioch. Okay, and we're going to cover that tonight. So we're going to begin by reading. We're just going to read verses 12 through 17, then we'll pick up with the rest later on. So if you'll follow along with me, this is Acts chapter 18, verses 12 through 17 says this. But when Gallio was proconsul of Achaia, the Jews made a united attack on Paul and brought him before the tribunal, saying, this man is persuading people to worship God contrary to the law. But when Paul was about to open his mouth, Gallio said to the Jews, if it were a matter of wrongdoing or vicious crime, O Jews, I would have reason to accept your complaint. But since it is a matter of questions about words and names and your own law, see to it yourselves. I refuse to be a judge of these things. And he drove them from the tribunal. And they all seized Sosthenes, the ruler of the synagogue, and beat him in front of the tribunal. But Gallio paid no attention to any of this. All right, so the first thing we see here, and I entitled this, Protection by a Roman. Okay, protection by a Roman. What's interesting is Paul, of course, you hear Paul, this phrase, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. Paul always went to the Jews first, but it's funny when he goes from town to town, the people that opposed Paul the most were the Jews. Of course, because what he was saying went against what they believed. And in this scenario, we're going to see that Paul is protected from the Jews by a Roman, and later on by some Greeks. So it's kind of interesting to see here. Okay, so the first thing we see here is this man named Gallio. He was a new governor. It says that he was, I use the word governor, it says proconsul. In essence, when I think of his position there, he would be somewhat like, we know the story of Jesus' crucifixion, and of course a huge player in that story is Pilate. All right, Gallio would have been similar to the position that Pilate would have had in Jerusalem or in Judea in Israel, being like a governor, a person who was over a large area. Gallio and it appears, when it says when Gallio was proconsul, the idea there is he was newly appointed. Okay, Gallio had been newly appointed there by Caesar. We don't know who was before him, but he'd been newly appointed. And it's interesting he was some of you probably heard of a man named Seneca. He was actually Seneca's brother. Now, I'm not a huge historian. I've heard the name Seneca. I don't know a lot about him, but he's fairly famous. He's the brother of Seneca. But the thing is, he's the new governor, new proconsul. He's the new person over this area. And most likely the Jews are thinking, okay, we got a new guy in. Sometimes when the new guy gets put in place, you're kind of testing to see, okay, what will this person, how will this person handle things? What are they going to do? So the Jews decide, and now of course we know from last time and from the previous verses that Paul and the Jews were not on good terms. Okay, Paul had gone to the synagogue, he had preached to them. They had rejected what Paul had to say. Paul made that statement like I read earlier, your blood be on your own heads. And Paul says, I'm done with you guys. So let's just say this, the Jews had it out for Paul. Okay? They wanted to hurt Paul. They wanted to do something. They wanted Paul. He was trouble to them. If you also remember, last time, down in verse 8, it says that Crispus, who had been the leader of the synagogue, he actually became a Christian. He got saved. So they're probably upset that Paul had come in and converted their leader. And now they have a new leader, and we'll talk about him in a minute. But so these are of course, obviously unconverted Jews. They're probably jealous. They're upset that as he's saying their old leader of their synagogue had been converted. They have a new one, and they're trying to get it. They're trying to get at Paul. Okay, so what do? They say this in verse 13. They bring Paul before the governor. They bring him before Gallio, and they say, this man is persuading people to worship God contrary to the law. Okay, so Paul was brought up on religious charges. They say he is preaching something that is contrary to the law. Now, what would have been contrary to the law? Okay, under Roman law, the Romans had certain religions which they deemed acceptable religions. Okay, I don't know exactly how it worked, but it was like you had their stamp of approval. They probably had some type of list or something like this. These are acceptable religions to practice. Okay, you cannot practice any other religions except for these, you could say, state-sponsored religions. All right, and if anybody invented a new religion or any other type of religion, nope, you couldn't do that. It was unlawful. All right, now Judaism happened to be a state-sponsored religion. So the Romans said, Judaism, it's fine. You can practice that. So the problem comes in. Now here's Paul. Okay. Now, I guess, to be honest, technically, the Jews were correct. You can get into law, there's technicalities, right? And of course, judges have to determine between technicalities. Okay. Because technically, we know that Christianity and Judaism are two very different religions. Okay, we know that. Okay, and the Jews knew that. So they're going to come before this Roman governor and say, listen, okay, we're practicing Judaism. Judaism is a state-sponsored religion. Okay, so it's okay for us to do it. But what this Paul guy, what he's preaching, that is a completely different religion. And like I said, technically they were correct. That it was a different religion, okay? Because, like I said here, Roman law did not allow for new religions. If anyone just starts, I'm going to start my own religion or something like that. No, you had to get it approved by the Roman government. So now, the Jews, have this accusation against Paul. Now, Paul was used to this. Paul dealt with accusations all the time. This was nothing new for him. And Paul was used to defending himself. All right? We see throughout the book of Acts, Paul is constantly defending himself against attacks. Okay? He's constantly doing this. So Paul's natural reaction when the Jews bring this accusation against him is to defend himself. So look what it says. All right? I love this. Verse 14. But when Paul was about to open his mouth. So Paul is just about to say something. He's just about to defend himself. All right? It says this. Gallio said to the Jews. Paul gets cut off. He's not given an opportunity to defend himself. And I don't know if Paul at first was like, what's going to happen here? Because, nope, Paul, you be quiet. I have something to say. I don't know exactly, you have to imagine what exactly happened. But it says Paul was ready, and I'm sure Paul would have had really good things to say, but he's not given that opportunity. And it's interesting because, as I was thinking about this, I go back to verse 10, all right? Verses 9 and 10 that we studied a few weeks ago, where God told Paul, do not be afraid, but go on speaking and do not be silent, for I am with you, and no one will attack you to harm you. Well, it's kind of interesting because the Bible's, it's so amazing how wise God was when he wrote the Bible and the things he put together, because it's interesting in verse 9 it says, no one will attack you. And then just 2 verses later, okay, verse 12 says, the Jews made a united attack on Paul. And I look at that and I think, wait, in one verse God says, no one's going to attack you, and then 2 verses later, they made an attack on him. All right? And it's like, and if you're Paul, you're thinking, wait, God just made this promise to me, and now what he promised wasn't going to happen is just happening. What's going on? And Paul's like, I have to defend myself. But now you know what? Paul doesn't have to defend himself because someone else is going to defend him. Gallio's going to defend him. And I put here, Paul did not need to defend himself because Gallio, and when I say Gallio, I'm thinking God put Gallio there on purpose. God was the one that was defending Paul. Because back in verse 10, where it says, no one will attack you to harm you. It wasn't just to attack you, but to harm you with the effect of you being harmed. Now, the Jews tried to attack him, but Gallio prevented that from happening. All right? Because when Paul was about to speak, Gallio spoke instead. And look what it is that Gallio says. All right? Gallio says this. Verse 14. Gallio said to the Jews, if it were a matter of wrongdoing or vicious crime, O Jews, I would have reason to accept your complaint. So he basically says, listen, if this Paul guy was doing violent crime, if he was out stealing, if he was out being violent, if he was out whatever, if he was doing serious criminal activities, I would get involved. All right? I would do something about it. But then in verse 15 he says, but since it is a matter of questions about words and names and your own law, see to it yourselves, I refuse to be a judge of these things. Now, I assume, you have to understand, I assume that a lot of times in the stories of Scripture, they don't necessarily give word for word the whole thing that happened. All right, I'm guessing, that the Jews probably got up and tried to explain to Gallio, this is why what Paul is teaching is not the same as our religion. That's probably, I'm reading between the lines here. And have you ever had somebody that was like very, very much like an expert in a certain area, and you were not an expert in that area at all, and they start explaining to you their area of expertise, and they kind of get into the weeds, they get really technical about it, and your eyes just kind of glaze over, and and you just kind of sit there and you nod, and you're like, oh, that's nice, and it makes no sense to you whatsoever, okay? I can't say that for sure exactly, but I can guess maybe that's kind of what happened with Gallio. I can just see one of the Jewish scribes or Pharisees or one of the guys getting up and saying, well, let me explain. In our religion, okay, we believe that there was a Messiah, that he's going to come, and that Paul believed, and they get into the whole thing about Jesus and whether he was the Messiah. Maybe they even start talking about prophecy, and I can just kind of see Gallio's eyes glaze over as they're trying to explain the fine details of the difference between Judaism and Christianity. Now for us, as Christians, we understand that difference. And we understand there's a real difference. But to Gallio, a Roman who doesn't know any of this stuff, he's just like, guys, it just sounds like you guys are just being, ticky-tack. So just, guys, why are you bothering me with this? I don't care. You guys, this is an internal dispute between you and Paul. And from my opinion, in essence, Gallio is saying, from my opinion, when I look at Judaism, when I look at Christianity, they look like the same thing to me, maybe just different aspects of it. Now, like I said, Gallio was wrong, but you know what? Paul didn't care, because that meant that Gallio was like, I'm not going to do anything to Paul. Now, I mean, you know how frustrated the Jews were? You know, because this guy, they thought that Gallio was going to, you know, I could just see them coming up to Gallio, and they're thinking that Gallio is going to be on their side and that they're going to be rid of Paul. But now Paul's basically been given Roman authority to go out and preach the gospel. Okay? And you know, and I mean, and God was completely in this entire time. All right? So like I said, Gallio defends Paul, and Gallio said, listen, this is a Jewish matter. You Jews, you handle your own internal dispute, okay? You handle your own internal dispute. All right, so the first thing we see is Paul is protected by a Roman. Gallio was a Roman, all right? Protection by a Roman. Second, we see here revenge by the Greeks. Revenge by the Greeks. And this is only one verse, okay, so I'll go over this fairly quickly. Oh, and I forgot, verse 16 says, and he drove them from the tribunal. And so basically, you know, Gallio's like, get out of here. Okay, I don't want anything to do with it, you know, just get out of my courtroom, basically. Then we get to verse 17. And they all seized Sosthenes, the ruler of the synagogue, and beat him in front of the tribunal, but Gallio paid no attention to any of this. So next thing we see is revenge by the Greeks. Okay, Sosthenes, who was the leader of the Jews. Now, if you remember, okay, previously the leader of the Jews was this man named Crispus. Crispus had converted to Christianity. He is now a Christian. So they need a new leader in their synagogue, and they choose a man named Sosthenes. He gets beaten. Now, there's a little bit of a debate. I think the debate's pretty one-sided, but I want to at least admit that there is another side of the debate. Because there in verse 17 where it says, and they all, okay, you have to understand the word they is a pronoun, all right? And, you know, there's always, with the pronoun, there's always an antecedent. Okay, so you always have to look and say, who is the antecedent? Okay, who is the they? Who's the they talking about? And to be honest, it's not completely clear, okay? I think it's pretty obvious, but I guess some commentators have difference of opinion. There's two options, really. Number one, option one, this was done by the Jews. Okay, because if you look back, it had been talking about, you know, the Jews, because notice in verse 16 it says, and he drove them, so some would say, well, because the them from the tribunal, and it says, and they all, so they try to make a grammatical connection there, that, well, the them in 16 must be the same as the them in 17, so this must be the Jews. So then there's this argument that, you know, Sosthenes being the leader of the Jews, he was the one that came before them, you know, and he was the one kind of pushing this thing, and then now now the Jews are all mad at Sosthenes that he did a bad job of accusing Paul, or that, or whatever, or they're mad that now that they look bad in front of the Romans or things like that, so they all beat him up. Okay, I kind of see that, but to me it makes most sense that this was done by the Greeks. Okay, you have to understand. Okay, the Greeks, this area. Okay, this is Greece. This is Corinth. It's a Greek city, but it's ruled by the Romans. All right, and you don't want to cause trouble for the people that are ruling over you. Okay, you don't want to cause trouble. And now, so you have to understand, in this city of Corinth, you're dealing with three different, nationalities, I guess. You have it's Roman rulership. It's mainly a Greek citizenship, but then you have this group of Jews that live there in Corinth. Okay? It was the Jews that kind of went over the head of the Greeks to go to the Romans. See what I'm saying? So you see how the Greeks would be pretty upset at the Jews, like, hey, what are you doing here? Why are you Jews causing trouble here in our Greek town? Now that's my interpretation. I think the Greeks are pretty upset because they also want to show, Gallio listen, we can take care of these problems. You don't have to be worried by them. Okay? So basically, Sosthenes gets hauled out by, I think, the Greeks and just beaten up. Now, he's not killed. He's just beaten up. And when this happens, Gallio just stands by and just kind of, I don't know if he actually physically watched. He knew it was happening, whether he was physically watching it or not. As it says, it happened in front of the tribunal. Had he left, very likely that he was there. But it says that he paid no attention to any of this. Okay? He paid no attention to any of this. And like I said, I agree with option 2. I believe that they were beaten by the Greeks. But here's the interesting thing. All right? So we're here in Acts chapter 18. Keep a finger in Acts 18 because we'll come back. But turn over to 1 Corinthians. All right? 1 Corinthians chapter 1. All right? 1 Corinthians chapter 1. Very interesting. Okay, now, sometimes you read things and you don't know any of the background, so we can speculate and try to figure out what happened, but you never know. So I'm not going to do too much speculation. I just want to show us this. Look how 1 Corinthians, now this is a few years later. Paul writes, later on, Paul's going to spend time in Ephesus, so it's probably just a couple years later. Paul writes 1 Corinthians. And when he writes 1 Corinthians, he's writing back to the church in Corinth, and look how he begins his letter. Paul, called by the will of God to be an apostle of Jesus Christ, and our brother Sosthenes. Okay? Isn't that pretty amazing? The very man that had been the leader of the Jews, leading this opposition to Paul, trying to get Paul imprisoned, trying to get, get Paul punished. He was beaten for doing that. Somehow in the next 2 years or so, we don't know the circumstances. We don't know what led to it. Like I said, we can make assumptions, but we don't know. Any assumption I make would just be complete hearsay. It would just be, this is what I think. But somehow, God orchestrated these events so that the second guy, because remember, Crispus was already the leader of the synagogue. He already gets saved. Now the next leader of the synagogue, he too gets saved. And Sosthenes becomes a believer and ends up in Ephesus with Paul. All right, we don't know how he got to Ephesus. We don't know when he went to Ephesus, but we know that he, I put it here, we do not know the circumstances of his salvation. We don't know how he got saved, when he got saved. All we know is that he was beaten in Acts chapter 18, and then in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, he's with Paul. All right, so he has become a believer. So I think that's a pretty amazing turn of events, let's say that. All right, so that brings us to the rest of this, and I'm just going to call this Paul's travels, okay? Paul's travels, just kind of a smattering of different things. So I'm just going to kind of go through it. This is kind of just more historical, so we understand exactly what happens. So let's read, we're in Acts 18, we're going to read the rest of this, verses 18 down through 23. It says this, After this, Paul stayed many days longer, and then took leave of the brothers and set sail for Syria, and with him Priscilla and Aquila. At Cenchrea, he had cut his hair, for he was under a vow. And they came to Ephesus, and he left them there. But he himself went into the synagogue and reasoned with the Jews. When they asked him to stay for a longer period, he declined. But on taking leave of them, he said, I will return to you if God wills. And he set sail from Ephesus. When he had landed at Caesarea, he went up and greeted the church, and then went down to Antioch. After spending some time there, he departed and went from one place to the next through the region of Galatia and Phrygia, strengthening all the disciples. So, Paul's travels. Let's just kind of look at some of the things of these few verses. First thing we see here is Paul left the church in the hands of the disciples. Okay, so Paul had been discipling these, he had discipled them for 18 months. Remember, Paul had been in this church for 18 months. He'd been growing the church, he'd been discipling the believers there, and he gets the point, it's like, okay, it's time for me to go. He's headed to Jerusalem. All right, he's headed to Jerusalem for a feast. Most people think he was probably there. It was probably Passover. He was going to Passover. And Paul but Paul leaves Corinth, and it says he leaves, and he takes Aquila and Priscilla with him, okay? He brought Priscilla and Aquila, and one of the things I love about this idea of just him bringing Priscilla and Aquila with him is they were valuable ministry partners for Paul. There's nowhere in Scripture that makes us believe that that this couple, Aquila and Priscilla, like that. I don't think that Aquila was a pastor. I don't think that he, in any sense, I think he was simply ministry partner with Paul. But I think that it was so valuable that Paul had they were tent makers together. Okay, they just worked together. But I think that shows the importance of the people that do the majority of the work in the church, and that's the members. We as pastors, we might get up and preach and have leadership and do different things, but the majority of the ministry that takes place are the Aquilas and the Priscillas, and they were so essential to Paul's ministry. They were so essential to what he did that he said, "Guys, can you come with me?" And he brought them with him to Ephesus. Okay, so he's headed to Ephesus. But it's interesting, there's so many times, there's just this phrase here. The end of verse 18, it says this: at Cenchrea, he had cut his hair, for he was under a vow. All right? So he had his hair cut because of a vow. That's all it says. Now we can read between the lines, and we can try to figure out all these things. Most likely this was a Nazirite vow. Okay? Now, when we think of the Nazirite vow, we think of people who were lifelong Nazirites. Okay? There were 3 people in the Bible who were lifelong Nazirites. Okay? That was Samson, Samuel, and John the Baptist. Okay? Samson, Samuel, and John the Baptist. They were Nazirites from birth to grave. But the majority of the Nazirites in the Bible weren't lifelong Nazirites. Okay? The Nazirite vow was something that usually somebody would take for a specific period of time. Maybe a month, maybe a couple months, maybe half a year, whatever it was. And of course, there were we know, you're probably familiar, there were 3 parts to the Nazirite vow, and all of them were significant. Okay? All right, the first part was for a man, you're supposed to let your hair grow. Okay, and the hair would get very long. And of course, for them, that would distinguish them because their hair would get long, and that would distinguish them from other men because other men would keep their hair cut short. The other thing is they were not supposed to partake of anything that had to do with grape products. Okay, so they couldn't eat grapes. All right, they couldn't eat raisins, all right, which are dried grapes. They couldn't drink any type of wine, alcoholic or non-alcoholic. They couldn't partake of that at all. Okay, and the third part of the Nazirite vow was you couldn't touch a dead body. Okay, you were supposed to avoid touching a dead carcass. Now you could eat cooked meat, all right, but raw dead carcass you couldn't handle that. So the Nazirite vow, and the point is not to get the Nazirite vow. It's not to get up into all the specifics of that. But the point was these people were set aside for a particular reason to dedicate themselves to God. Now, we don't know why. The reason we think it's a Nazirite vow is because it says he cut his hair. So the assumption, and like I said, the assumption is at some point during his time in Corinth, okay, Paul had taken a Nazirite vow. That's probably what happened. All right? How long it had been going, we don't know. All right? But he'd taken a vow, and most likely, like I said, we could get into the reasons why, but we don't know. It was simply to dedicate himself to God for whatever reason. All right? And he'd probably been and had that Nazirite vow for quite a time while he'd been in Corinth, whether it was, he was in Corinth for 18 months. I don't know if it was the entire 18 months. Maybe he'd done it a year in or something like that. But it'd been long enough to where his hair had gotten, he'd been under this vow for long enough where his hair had gotten longer than usual for him. All right? So it looks like he decided once he left the town of Corinth, he wasn't under that vow anymore. Most likely because that was a vow, it was assigned to the rest of the Corinthians. Okay? And now he's leaving, and he didn't have that. It was a vow so that they could see it. So he gets to Cenchrea and he cuts his hair. All right? So he leaves Corinth, stops at Cenchrea, gets a haircut, and then he moves on to the next, and then he moves on. So I wanted to show us here, I knew I had a map, I couldn't remember where it was. So this is where he's headed. So you probably can't see very well, but this is Corinth right here, okay? This is Corinth right here where he was. And then Cenchrea was the port city. So basically Cenchrea was where he was. Corinth is a little bit inland, then Cenchrea is the port where he would get on a boat and leave, all right? So he's getting on a boat to head over here. Notice this is Caesarea over here. This is where he's headed because he's headed to Jerusalem, right? So he's going to get on a boat and go all the way across the Mediterranean Sea, but he doesn't go directly this way. He goes across here to go to Ephesus for, I'm guessing, kind of like, like here. It's not really a straight line there. It's kind of this, but that was probably the best layover. Sometimes you guys know, I could be flying to Minneapolis and have a layover in like San Diego, you never, it's like, it's that way, but I'm flying this way, So you never know why you have layovers that aren't directly, the route, but my reason is God wanted him in Ephesus. Okay, so maybe that was the best trip. So he stops in Ephesus. That's where his layover is. Okay, so he's going to stop in Ephesus. All right. So next we have Paul preaches in Ephesus. Okay, Paul preaches in Ephesus. Verse 19. It says this, and they. Now let me just stop there. I know it's they. Remember, who's the they? Paul, Aquila, and Priscilla. Now, what's interesting to note is who's not mentioned, okay? And this is where we don't know exactly, but who's not mentioned is Silas is not mentioned, okay? Timothy's not mentioned. Remember, those had been Paul's partners as they'd been going. But my guess is, and if you look, Paul had been sending Silas and Timothy to other places from Corinth. It was almost like Corinth kind of became Paul's home base of operation for a year and a half. And then his ministry partners saw Silas and Timothy, because he had done work in Philippi, he'd done work in Berea, he'd done work in Athens, he'd done work in Thessalonica, he'd done work, and it seems like he would send Silas, hey, can you go check on this city? Hey, Timothy, can you go check on this city? It seems like he'd sent them out to different places, and when he leaves, he'd probably send them other places, and he decides, I'm going to take Aquila and Priscilla with me instead. So we don't know exactly where Silas and Timothy were at this time, but who's with him is Aquila and Priscilla. And it says this, verse 19, and they came to Ephesus, and he left them there, but he himself went into the synagogue and reasoned with the Jews. This is what Paul does. When he arrives in a city, first thing he does, he goes to the synagogue, and he preaches. It says he reasoned with the Jews. And there's an interesting result. Now, we've seen this before. It's happened a couple other times. Because it says this, verse 20, when they asked him to stay for a longer period, he declined. Sometimes when Paul would go to a synagogue, the Jews would immediately put up their defenses and say, we don't like what you have to say. But every once in a while, Paul would come to a city, and they'd say, Paul, what you're saying is very intriguing. Can you come back again next week? And that's what they said. Paul, please, we want to hear more. And, sometimes we have those conversations, this happens at, this happens at church, that even happened this morning, okay? I sit up here, and sometimes at the end of the service, Pastor Jason, I am listening to you, but sometimes in my mind, I'm thinking, I need to talk to this person after the service. You guys know what I'm talking about? So at the end, I'm like, okay, I got to talk to somebody. And then you're going, and then somebody stops you and starts talking to you, right? And you're like, so you're having a nice conversation. But then by the time you're done with the conversation, then you're looking at the person, and they're out the parking lot. And you're like, oh. And you're like frustrated that person, So sometimes I'm just rude. I'm like, hey, I'd love to talk, but I got to talk to somebody that's more important than you. That doesn't sound good, but it's just the truth, okay? And in essence, that's what Paul is saying to the Ephesians, okay? He's in Ephesus, and they're like, Paul, we love what you have to say. And Paul's like, listen, I love you guys and everything, but I got to get to Jerusalem right now, and if I stay and preach here, I'm not going to make it, okay? Now, it's interesting. There's a textual variant here. Some of the there's a textual variant. Some places say that he was headed to a feast in Jerusalem. Now, not all say it, but I think there's enough truth. Whether it's was actually, and they're not. I think it is actually true because he does end up in Jerusalem. But he needed to get, and it's most likely he was going there for a feast. Okay, and like I said, it was most likely Passover. But Paul says, "Listen, guys, I'm sorry, I can't do this right now. But here's what I like. Here's what I love." Okay. Verse 21. But on taking leave of them, he said, "I will return to you," and I love this, "if God wills." See, here's what Paul knew, and here's what he wanted the Ephesians to know. Guys, I think that God wants me to come back here and minister to you, but that's up to him. And this is what we have to remember in all of our ministry. Okay? In all of our ministry, there's always this in the back, whether we actually say it or not. And I think it's a good thing for us to be a regular part of our vocabulary. I don't, think sometimes we can get overdo it. But I think a regular part of our vocabulary, whether it's verbalized or whether it's just thought, is I'm going to do this if God wills. Because ultimately it's not me that's doing the ministry. It's God working through me to do the ministry. And there may be something that God doesn't want me to do. I have my goals, I have my ambitions, but you know what? I can't be so inflexible that I'm not willing to let God change those plans. So what Paul says to the Ephesians is this: listen, guys, I'll be back, Lord willing. And we know the end of the story. Paul didn't know the end of the story at that time. It was Lord willing. Paul's going to end up in Ephesus pretty soon. He'll be back in like a year or two. Right? He's going to go to Jerusalem. He's going to go to Antioch. He's going to go up to Galatia. But he's going to end up in Ephesus because it was Lord willing. And I think that's just a reminder to us that we should always make plans, but allow God to change those plans if needed. But thankfully for this one, God didn't change Paul's plan. So I put here, they wanted Paul to remain longer, but he was in a hurry to get to Jerusalem. So Paul did the next best thing. Okay? Paul did the next best thing. Remember, he's traveling, and I think this changed Paul's plans. I think this is the type of thing where Paul had plans, because he brought Aquila and Priscilla with him, and I would assume that his plan was Aquila and Priscilla were going to keep traveling with him, but he left Aquila and Priscilla in Ephesus. Because when the Ephesians said, "Paul, we want to hear more of what you have to say," I think he said, "You know what? I can't stay here, but I know who can. Aquila and Priscilla." All right? Aquila and Priscilla. And we know this because, and this is going to be what we're going to talk about next week. Okay? Aquila and Priscilla had a big impact on the people in Ephesus because they ended up discipling a man named Apollos in Paul's absence. Okay, but we'll talk about Apollos next week. All right, so Paul continues. All right, so Paul went to Jerusalem. Now, map back up here. So, gets on a boat, comes from Ephesus, and the boat takes him all the way across the Mediterranean Sea, and he comes right here to Caesarea. Okay, he comes right there to Caesarea, which is kind of cool. We were in Caesarea last summer, which was pretty cool. So he lands there in Caesarea, and then he travels down here to Jerusalem. Now, how do we know he went to Jerusalem? Let me just explain something here. So if you look at verse 22, it says this: when he had landed at Caesarea, he went up and greeted the church. Okay. When we are talking, we always think north, south, east, as Americans, we think north, south, east, west. So if I say I'm going to Seattle, I say I'm going up to Seattle. All right? If I'm in Seattle and I'm going to go to Portland, I say I'm going down to Seattle. The up means I'm going north, the down means I'm going south. Okay? So as Americans, okay, we would look at this and say, well, he wasn't going up because he was going south. But you have to understand, they're not Americans like us. They're not thinking north, south, east, west. They're thinking, they're thinking elevation-wise, all right? Throughout the Bible, when they'd go to Jerusalem, because Jerusalem's up on a hill, they'd always say, I'm going up to Jerusalem, okay? Even if you're going south, you're going up because you're going up in elevation. So over and over and over, the Jews would understand the phrase going up means Jerusalem, okay? So I think it's pretty obvious, and everybody agrees. I mean, there's nobody that disagrees that when it says he went up, that means he was going to Jerusalem. There's also the fact that, like I said, there is a textual variant back in whatever verse that was, verse 21, where some of the texts talk about he had to go to a feast in Jerusalem. All right, and that's the other reason why he couldn't stay in Ephesus, because he probably needed to get to this feast for a specific reason. All right, so when he landed at Caesarea, and even on this map, like it shows the up going to Jerusalem. So back to this, he most likely attended a feast. Most people think that feast was Passover. There's probably a reason. Of course, on these missionary journeys, he didn't go to Passover every year. He couldn't make it to Jerusalem for Passover every year, but there were probably certain times where it was important for him to be there to attend Passover. We don't know why, but most likely. All right, then, he went to Antioch. Remember, Antioch is his home church. All right, Antioch is his home church. End of verse 22, and then went down to Antioch. So you go up to Jerusalem, elevation, you go down to Antioch. All right, verse 23, after spending some time there, we don't know how long, okay, he was there for, I don't know, maybe a couple months, maybe a few months, we don't know exactly. All right, but understand this, Paul, he's in Antioch, and remember, Antioch's his home church, they're his sending church, but in the back of his mind, he's like, he's just, in my mind, I'm thinking Paul can't get out of his mind the church at Ephesus. And he's thinking, I got to get back to them. I promised them I'd be there if God wills. I left Aquila and Priscilla there. I got to get back there. All right? So Paul's thinking he has to get back to Ephesus. So what does he do? He begins his third missionary journey. All right? So he went on his first missionary journey where he went over to Cyprus. Then he went up into Asia Minor, Antioch of Pisidia, Lystra, Derbe, Iconium, those cities. That was his first missionary journey. Second missionary journey, he goes a little bit farther. He goes over to Greece. He goes to Macedonia, Philippi, Thessalonica, Achaia, Corinth, Athens, places like that. He comes back. Now this is his third missionary journey he's about to head on. All right? And he goes to, once again, it says that he returned to, it says Galatia and Phrygia. All right? So one more time, this map here. Notice up here, is Galatia. So he comes up here so this is his third time going through here, this area of Galatia. He's probably hitting Lystra, Derbe, Iconium there. But where he's heading over here to Ephesus. So he's making his way from Antioch, going through these cities. He's been here before, and he's going to go meet Aquila and Priscilla. And next week, we're going to see when he gets back to Ephesus. Now he's been gone, travel back then was not quick. It was slow travel, and he traveled a long way, but he made this circle. Ephesus, Caesarea, Jerusalem, Antioch, back here to Ephesus. Okay, so he made this counterclockwise circle, and he'll make it back to Ephesus. And when we come back next week, we'll see what that ministry in Ephesus looks like. Because he's going to spend 3 years in Ephesus. And so, all right, let's close in a word of prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you so much for the truth of your word, God, as we've just seen some of the travels of Paul and his ministry in Corinth and then Ephesus and different places. God, I thank you just for the standard that he set and what he did in his mission work of just loving and caring for people and ministering to many people. I thank you for the truth of your word. Help it to impact our lives. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.